the growing interconnectedness of countries of the world and the cultures of the world, economically, politically, socially.
My idea of it is that it's the exchange and flow of both intellectual and material property. So people sharing ideas, people sharing goods, inventions, technology.
The development of connections between countries in the world that leads to the exchange of goods and services and products.
I think globalization is basically like a melting pot of different cultures, not necessarily one dominating another, but a combination of multiple ideas or traditions.
I think that there's a danger of people all wanting to ascribe to the same values and ideals. Usually they're Western ones. I think there's a danger of things like McDonald's wiping out, indigenous restaurants. So I think that we need to have an active effort to maintain culture in different parts of the world, but it's also good to keep that exchange of ideas flowing so we can work towards a better future.
I think it's actually globalization in terms of like internet has really facilitated globalization because it's like easy exchange of ideas. There's no limit really to what you can access. But also the negative point of globalization can also be like assimilation and how one culture could just fade away because of a dominating culture. Like people say like American culture is kind of like this homogeneous culture that tends to overpower other ones. And in that sense, like I know our movies, American movies, are spread throughout all over and have a tendency to be more popular and spread more than, let's say, like a Japanese movie.
Well, there's a diffusion of culture. I think that's pretty obvious, but there's also some negative effects in terms of imperialism, how some countries' cultures kind of overwhelm others. For instance, American culture has a tendency to override any native culture, whether it be Madonna or American Idol or Hollywood, whatever. It always seems to overwhelm anything else.
Globalization is more than just a nice buzzword that people like to use to talk about society at large. It has many facets and avenues and interpretations. Even the definition of globalization is varied depending on scholars. So then, what exactly is globalization? Well, according to the Levin Institute at the State University of New York, globalization is a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations, a process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. Now, that is quite a mouthful, so we're going to break it down into pieces. The first part of the definition deals with who globalization brings together and to interact and integrate. This consists of people, companies, and governments of different nations. Globalization is not just isolated to governments or international trade organizations. Globalization can begin at the smallest level with the individual and continue all the way up to groups as large as nations or international corporations. The second part of the definition expresses what drives the interaction and integration of these groups. International trade and investment are the large ones, and they are aided by today's technology. Now, before anyone jumps to the idea that technology has opened up the world to globalization, we need to take a jump back in history, for globalization is no new concept. For a number of years, people, and as time has worn on, corporations, have been buying and selling from each other across the globe. If you return to your middle school or high school history classes, think about trade and bartering that went on throughout various areas in the world. Probably the most common example would have been the Silk Road that connected China and Europe and allowed for European countries to visit the East and return with spices and silk to the West. This connection between cultures has been going on for much longer than this past century. However, the dramatic increase in communication technology, as well as changes in international trade policy, has allowed for a much larger scale in economic development. Anthony Giddens, a structuration theorist, looks at the corresponding change in our sense of time and space. He argues that there have been structural changes in power through globalization, such as technological developments, that have led to the change in our sense of time and space. We are now able to live and work across spatial and temporal dimensions that are separated from one another. As New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman said, "Today, globalization is farther, faster, cheaper, and deeper. This is unlike the globalization of the past, where interaction was limited by space constraints and proximity. So now that we know who is involved in globalization and how globalization is carried out, it is time to examine what exactly globalization has an impact on. Basically, globalization impacts almost everything and everyone throughout the world. Globalization impacts the environment, political systems, economic development of countries, human well-being of societies, and culture. Culture is the area that our group would like to examine a little bit closer. We will now examine 2 examples of how globalization has allowed for a spreading of culture throughout the world. We will examine the impact of the Olympics as well as anime.
Our first example of globalization and how it impacts culture is the Olympics. The Olympics is the largest sporting event in the world where athletes from over 200 countries gather together to compete for the top-ranked gold medal in their respective events. Media has played a large role in globalizing this event. With the advent of television, broadcasting the games is tailored towards each specific country. In the United States, during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, many of the televised events were of the U.S. athletes. Only select competitions from other countries played on American airwaves. The same can be said of China, where very few images of other countries were displayed on Chinese television. Another interesting view was that of the medal count. In Olympics past, the country with the most gold medals was considered to be the winner of the games. However, the U.S. chose to focus on the total medal count last year, seeing as they were behind China in terms of gold, but ahead in terms of total. This change reflects how countries choose to portray themselves against the rest of the other nations competing in the games. While the Olympic event is meant to bring together nations, it often causes divisions rather than unification. However, the Olympics is truly one of the shining examples of a globalized event, bringing together the world for a few short weeks. It enables all to learn about the common themes that bond us together while celebrating the uniqueness of each culture. Our next example is that of anime, which is Japanese animation. Anime entered the U.S. with varying levels of success. Part of the reason for the success of anime was the change in the target audience. In the U.S., the main demographic of cartoons animation was that of children. With the onset of anime in America, the target audience shifted. What had once been a child demographic shifted to college-age and graduate student populations. The reason for the rise in popularity was due to the absence of mature animated programming in the U.S. Japanese animation became a part of the U.S. culture, and over time, the phenomenon that we know today took root in the U.S. Here is a short clip of an episode of Pokémon translated into Spanish.
Ash es un niño de Pueblo Paleta.
Y como ya tengo 10 años, por fin podré conseguir mi permiso Pokémon.
Shown, anime is now translated in a number of countries around the world. Despite the translation, people still know that Pokémon is Japanese because this trend is worldly enough that it is now considered a globalized craze. This shows a different aspect of globalization, one of adapting a certain aspect of a culture to match the language of a different one, therefore identifying a new way in which globalization functions.
There is one last thing we would like to address before closing. Globalization is a deeply controversial issue. The reason for the controversy stems mostly from economic issues. Those that are proponents of globalization find that poor countries and their citizens are able to develop economically and raise the standard of living in their society. Opponents find that globalization allows for an international free market in which local cultures and people are exploited and only the multinational organizations of the Western world profit. It is important that there be a balance between benefits and costs. In order for that to happen, citizens and nations need to understand what globalization is and how it works. We hope that you have enjoyed our educational video on globalization. In our world today, it is important to understand how we are all interconnected. Continue to examine information related to globalization so that you can remain knowledgeable and up to date on all matters of globalization. Thank you.